Bert was a protege of our beloved Armin Goldman, who had brought him there, and he was doing research in Houston. And Armin said to me, "Oh, Dr. Garza is such a promising young man. Please be nice to him and be sure to applaud." So we're here again to applaud Dr. Garza, who's had a very interesting career. He was originally a researcher in Houston and published some incredibly advanced work on human milk. But then they lured him to Cornell, which is just south of Rochester, you know. And he was chair of the Department of Nutrition at Cornell, and we had a wonderful liaison with Rochester, doing some very interesting work together. But he didn't stay there long. He was lured to Boston. Of course, he'd been in Boston before. Dr. Garza has an MD and a PhD and all of that sort of thing. And he became a vice president of Boston College, what has hopefully become the Stanford of the East. Am I right, Bert? Anyway, he went into academics full time, but not really, because he still worked with the World Health Organization and UNICEF and all of these global programs on nutrition. Bert was chair of the committee that worked out the benefits of human milk in various countries around the world, and many other projects. He also was the first founders lecturer for the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine in 2006, and has gotten many awards and citations, and I think you've been crowned too, haven't you? But I'm going to let Dr. Garza tell you his story.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I will try to see if we can't regain some time, because I know you're running a little bit late. And want to bring you up to date as quickly as I can about expanding the research and scope of a new paradigm that was introduced about 10 years ago. It's been expanded now to fetal and fetal growth, but initially it was targeting young child well-being. I work on that end of the spectrum that hopefully provides the evidence base that makes your work, we hope, easier and more effective, and also providing some of the tools. Growth curves are probably the most frequently, most intensely used tool in all of public health, clinical medicine. You find them in every pediatric office, in health ministries, in health clinics, so that they really permeate the spectrum of healthcare. There's two efforts that I want to bring you up to date with. One is the multi-center growth reference study that led to the new WHO growth references that are all based on breastfed children. I'm going to spend a little bit of time because I realize that some of you may not be familiar with it. And the other is a brand new project that has just been completed by Oxford colleagues. It is titled Intergrowth 21, which enables growth monitoring during the fetal period, beginning at about 9 weeks on through delivery. And they have followed some of these infants into the second year of life. I'm glad to say that these two efforts merge very nicely together so that they represent an opportunity for a continuum of care now from gestation on through the second year of life, so that it covers the first 1,000 days that increasingly are recognized as critical to child well-being. Both these efforts are based on a prescriptive approach. What do I mean by that? Well, they've been designed to describe how children should grow regardless of time and place, rather than the way that growth references had been done in the past, which described how children grow at a particular time and or particular place. And that subtlety is terribly important but I hope will become clear as to why it's so important as in the presentation. Well, there are other common design features to these two efforts other than both using a prescriptive approach. Both have had an international worldwide participation. It has used community-based sampling so that we avoid a lot of the biases that in fact might have emerged had we used a hospital-based sample. And they had unprecedented strong quality controls, which I think were largely responsible for some of the very good and robust data that were obtained. What do these international growth standards now represent? Well, as I said briefly earlier, they enable growth monitoring from 9 weeks of gestation to about 5 years postnatally, although this group I think would be more interested up to the second year. It enables improved support and management of pregnancy and postnatal care, especially breastfeeding, because of these new curves, women, physicians no longer have to cope with the idea that at least breastfed children appear to be falling off in their growth charts early on in postnatal life. It enhances the potential for improved maternal-child policies and goals, and perhaps these can emerge in our discussion period. And it also opens various research opportunities, especially I think in our treatment of prematures and low birth weight infants. Well, the MGRS, the study that led to the WHO standards, had two components, a longitudinal one from 0 to 24 months that overlapped with a cross-sectional one from 18 to 71 months, but it provided data then for those 5 years in 6 different countries involving over 9,000 children. The intergrowth study had three complementary studies. There is a newborn cross-sectional study of newborns that were followed for 12 consecutive months in all centers. There's a fetal growth longitudinal study from 14 weeks to birth with a follow-up to age 2. And there is the preterm postnatal follow-up because these individuals followed, I think something like 12,000, 15,000 births throughout the globe. Some of these infants were born premature, and in fact, they continued to follow these infants. And so they were able to look at the precursors and the sequelae of the prematurity. The eligibility criteria that were used for the study populations were all very similar. These were based on healthy populations. How do healthy children grow? Setting the bar, I think, for public health in a very robust way. So they were done with SES populations that did not constrain growth. Now, those conditions differed because, in fact, there were individuals from countries as diverse as India and Norway in the population. Altitude was controlled because of the impact that has on growth to less than 1,500 meters in the MGRS, 1,600 meters in the intergrowth study. Both looked at low mobility target populations because they were going to be longitudinal. For the breastfeeding, the MGRS, we wanted at least some evidence that at least 20% of mothers were going to be able to follow feeding recommendations. I'm glad to say that we achieved success rates of 80%, which were unprecedented in terms of the number of women that were breastfeeding either predominantly or exclusively for 6 months with continued breastfeeding for 1 year. But in order to do that, we needed to have an existing breastfeeding support system that we could build on. And I think that accounted for the very high level of success and the presence of collaborative institutions. If we look at the eligibility criteria for individuals, again, it was no health, environmental, or economic constraints on growth, mothers willing to follow feeding recommendations, term birth, single births, lack of significant morbidity, no smoking before or after delivery, and expanded criteria for intergrowth, such as known last menstrual period and natural conception. So there were no in vitro conceptions, for example, in the intergrowth population. The intergrowth study was done in very diverse places: Seattle, Brazil, the UK, Italy, Ghana, Tanzania, India, and China. The MGRS was done at Davis, Brazil, Accra in Ghana, Muscat in Oman, New Delhi, and Norway. So very, very worldwide in its orientation. Environments were very different, but as I said, everybody was screened to make sure that, in fact, they were healthy and had access to good health care. Well, the intergrowth outcomes are going to be newborn cross-sectional birth weights, lengths, head circumference for gestational age standards, and IUGR and preterm phenotypes. The fetal growth longitudinal study will provide international fetal growth standards, and the preterm postnatal follow-up study will provide preterm postnatal growth standards, primarily length, weight, and head circumference for all of them, other than for the fetal longitudinal study, where obviously there will be crown rump lengths, abdominal circumferences, and a variety of other measures. The WHO growth standards expanded the attained growth and growth velocity, so we now have many more anthropometric measures that are internationally determined than were available in the past. And these are what the data look like for the intergrowth study. For the UK, the USA, sorry, that was Kenya, not Tanzania, Italy, China, India, Kenya, Oman, and Brazil. And if you look at the crown rump length from 9 weeks to 14 weeks, you see the incredible overlap, demonstrating that, in fact, all children, if you meet their health needs, have the ability to grow very similarly in the intrauterine environment in the same way that they grow postnatally, despite the fact that their parental stature varied enormously across these countries, which calls into question, I think, a lot of the data that we have been confronted with in terms of maternal constraints. If you look at how good the data are modeled, this slide breaks out that data a little bit differently, looking at the 97th, the 97th, 50th, and 3rd centiles, again showing you the overlap between the empirical data and the model data. It really is quite gratifying to see. This gives you fetal head circumferences by gestational age for those same countries for the period following from 15 weeks to 45 weeks. Again, enormous overlap internationally across all of those countries. This does the same thing in terms of breaking it out by for the 2.5, 50th, and 97.5 percentiles, again showing the incredible overlap among all those sites. And the same thing is true for newborn lengths. These data are going to provide gestational age specific newborn lengths so that one will have the ability to assess in the newborn nursery the appropriateness of that length for specific children born at various gestational weeks. Newborn lengths pretty much overlap across and from 35 and a half through 40 weeks, and then you have the all gestational age there at your extreme right. This is the one slide I included in terms of the MGRS study, again showing the growth over the first 2 years of life in the 6 countries that are indicated there, again showing that just remarkable overlap and the universality of growth, one's characteristics, once we are able to assure that health needs are met. So what are the most frequent questions we get as these new standards are going to be published? People will often say, well, gee, aren't the genetics very different among these various populations? And so if the genetics are different, why do indeed these growth curves overlap as much as I've illustrated here? Well, yes, tall parents will tend to have tall children, and short parents will tend to have short children. But the variation exists between people, not between populations or among people. And so if we look at the genetics of growth, there are now approximately 200 genes that have been associated with stature. They explain a whopping 10% of the natural variability that we see. So overwhelmingly, growth is influenced by the environment, which includes nutrition, especially in the first 2 years of life. They also will ask me, well, are these appropriate for use in undernourished populations? And I brought one slide to illustrate how appropriate that would be. They also then, let's skip that other one. And this is, I'm gonna end at this slide. What this does is to demonstrate the projected adult heights of children that were born in Brazil, Ghana, India, Norway, Oman, and the US that participated in that postnatal study. There's some very old data in the literature suggesting that you can double a child's length at 2 years of age to predict adult height. That works pretty well for populations. It doesn't work as well for the individuals, but for populations, it gives you a pretty good sense. Well, if that's true, then one would have predicted that given the fact that at least in 4 of the 6 sites, we had some very short mothers, that in fact, if there was maternal constraint that was operating over the long term, that in fact we should have seen shorter predicted adult heights in those populations as well. And so when we compared twice the length at 2 years of age with the mid-parental heights, the prediction was that there would be no differences in Norway and the US. And that's exactly what we found. It's this one. And that for the other 4 sites, what we would see were substantial differences in the child's favor, suggesting again that even for undernourished populations, if children are breastfed, and appropriate complementary feeding is that we can redress stunting rates within 1 generation and do it, in fact, quite effectively. So the other 4 sites, what this shows you is that doubling that child's height at 2 years of age shows that, in fact, they would be anywhere from 5 to 9, 8 centimeters larger than the mid-parental heights. So all of these kids will be substantially taller than their parents, despite the fact that they were still in the same environment. But we screened them for making sure that their health needs were being met, with a rather glorious outcome for what happens when children are breastfed for 6 months, with continued breastfeeding for at least a year, and at least half of these children were breastfed beyond that period of time. So thank you.